that Russia is still the largest geographical entity in the world. It's about 3 times the size of Australia. So, you know, from Petersburg to Vladivostok is 3 times the distance from Sydney to Perth. So how would we feel if we were sat in Canberra and we were ruling another large, resource-rich, sparsely populated country, where Perth would be where Vladivostok now is? That's the exact similar distance. Lord knows, in my defence planning days, we knew that no Australian politician could dismiss the fact that we sit in a large, sparsely populated, resource-rich country that one day, particularly in the northern approaches, could leave us very vulnerable. And of course, Putin sits on a Siberia that is very vulnerable, not least because China has not formally renounced what it calls the unequal treaties of Nerchinsk and Aigun. How credible are all these ambitions of this man who's going to be around till the late 2020s, unless somebody knocks him off? How credible is it? Well, colleagues would immediately remind me that Russia has enormous weaknesses, more so than the former Soviet Union. The demography of Russia now is in serious trouble. The average age of expectancy of men is about 60, 62, and that's because, frankly, they drink themselves to death. And it's no exaggeration. Go there and try drinking with them. They drink hard stuff, 60% proof vodka, and they're dying early, and it's nothing new in Russian history. If you go back and read Dostoevsky and Turgenev and others, you'll see it's there. It's an illness of the first magnitude. And economically, it's a petro-economy that is the largest exporter of oil and natural gas in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia, but the price has dropped from over $100 to, what's it now, 40 or something a barrel? And what else does it have? Well, it's the second biggest exporter of arms, particularly to China and India, and it has precious little else. The educated elite are leaving in droves, and you'll meet them, by the way, in Canberra. You'll meet them in all sorts of occupations. But because he controls the power and the money, in what a famous American academic, Karen Daisha, has called Putin's kleptocracy. I mean, you know, the billionaires outnumber pretty well any other country except China. Go to Kensington and see how they own most of London. It's a kleptocratic state, deeply corrupt, but he controls the levers not just of power but of money. And he has announced in the last 12 months that increasing money will go into the Russian military. By 2020, 70% of the Russian military will have modern high-performance weapons, he says. Now that depends very much on the trajectory of the economy and where oil and natural gas and other things go. But don't get me wrong on this. Although they've lost a lot of very bright people, there's still fundamental deep nationalism in Russia. The acquaintance with the Russian soul and the Russian soil and Russian music and literature is deeply entrenched, including amongst the elite. And they still have the capacity as a highly educated country, more so than China at present, to develop particularly advanced and nasty weapons. Particularly advanced and nasty weapons. And Putin has announced, you know, new generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles with capabilities, so he says, to evade American ballistic missile defense, new generation of ballistic missile firing intercontinental nuclear warhead submarines, and you've seen, you know, new fighter aircraft, tanks, and so on. And you saw both, particularly in Crimea, a professional operation with special forces, Spetsnaz, and the elite airborne troops, cutting off the entirety of the Ukraine communications and cyber suppression, and militarily fait accompli. And in a different way with the little green men in eastern Ukraine, you're seeing that sort of pressure. It's a new form of hybrid war, deniable. We all know he's lying through his teeth. I've just read something before I came in out of Moscow that the 76th Airborne Division in Pskov, within 20 kilometers of the Estonian border, lost 40 people recently dead in Ukraine. All this has been hushed up and so on. Moving on. So why does Russia feel so threatened? Well, I think I've answered a lot of that. Their geographical vulnerabilities, they feel, are enormous. And it wasn't just Bonaparte and the Germans. It was, as I've mentioned to you, 250 years of brutal occupation by the Golden Horde of Genghis Khan. And in Australia, much to the despair of whichever Swedish ambassador we have here, we all forget the defeat of the Swedes at a place called Poltava, which is deep in Ukraine, where the Russians in 1709 lured the Swedish army, which by that time was the big military power in that part of Europe, deep into Russia, and then finished it off. So both its geography and its experience of war, and not least, of course, the Second World War, is a big part of the answer. I mean, we often felt in the Cold War that the Soviets and the communist regime really exaggerated the Second World War. And we used to have big brawls between Defence Intelligence and ONA about whether the losses of the Red Army were real or were exaggerated. Well, we now know that the figures, based on very careful demographic analysis, is that the total losses by the Soviet Union in the Second World War were 29 million dead, of whom 10 million were soldiers and the rest were civilians. Now you could say they brought a lot on themselves, because of Stalin's ignoring the threat from the Germans and the way he killed a lot of the senior military figures in the Great Terror of the late 1930s. But for most Russians still these days, including ordinary Russians, the May Day celebration of victory for what's called the Great Patriotic War, and it's worth, by the way, watching that parade. Watch 16,000 members of the Moscow garrison marching in absolute step, almost as good as the Commonwealth, what's it called, Michael, what's your guard? Federation Guard. I was being a bit sarcastic, I shouldn't do that. So, I don't dismiss their concern that now they have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland sharing common borders with a Russia that has not shared them with those countries for a very long time. Now, of course, there's a sense of victory in those countries, and I can understand that there were countries that were so badly and brutally occupied in the communist period. But there are issues that will not go away in my view, and I'll come to that shortly. Let me give you one sort of example. Why, in my view, is Vladimir Putin's non-negotiable demand on Ukraine? Is it EU? Is it NATO? Is it both? My view is non-negotiable, bottom line, whether we like it or not, and we don't like it, and shouldn't, is he will not tolerate Ukraine being a member of NATO, and he will be prepared to go to war. If there are Ukrainians here, they will probably now contradict me. As Solzhenitsyn, who was not some left-wing communist, said when he went back to Russia, and I quote, "All we Russians have Ukrainian blood in us. All we Russians have Ukrainian blood." Now, a Ukrainian would dismiss that and say, the language and all that. That is not the view of the vast and overwhelming majority of Russians. And, it's not something I care for. I can see that Ukrainians want to have an independent, one of these days, democratic, which it sure as hell isn't at present, country. But if NATO had troops in the northern part of Ukraine, the distance from those troops to Moscow is the distance from Canberra to Melbourne. And ask me how we would feel if we had troops from a certain Asian country to our north, that distance away from us, we'd go off our tiny little minds. So the NATO thing, in my view, is central, as well as his fear that democracy will be imposed on him by a coloured revolution. They're the two critical issues. So he's now in league with President Xi Jinping, who sat next to him at the May Day parade this May. In their different ways, I think they're both in league to resist American hegemony and the established order. Putin is more anti-Western, in my view, but some others might have a different view, than Xi Jinping, for obvious reasons. And I'm not suggesting some sort of alliance. I think it's a relationship of convenience. The Chinese have been careful not to treat Russia as little brother, because Russia was always the superior power. And if you go to Siberia, this should be well known to us Australians, again, Siberia, large, sparsely populated, resource-rich, difference, sharing a 4,600-mile border with 1.2 billion Chinese. There's no love lost, frankly, racially and culturally. What is the perspective from Europe? This March I was in Stockholm and Helsinki. Main reason I was doing some work with foreign affairs, but they asked me to stay on and talk to the defence and foreign ministries of those countries and the intelligent people about how they saw regional security. And I went along well armed to talk about the rise of China and the choice between China and the United States and all that good stuff. And they rapidly told me they were not terribly interested in that. Paul, there's only one country. It starts with R and ends with A. And it's not up to any good. Their views. And they walked me through the military provocations now that Russia is mounting, which are at least on the same basis in frequency and proximity and potential danger as they experienced in the Cold War. So in the last calendar year, the Russians mounted 400 close proximity military aircraft penetrations of NATO airspace and of non-NATO EU countries. I was shown a photograph in Stockholm of an SAS airliner leaving Copenhagen with a Sukhoi 30 90 metres off the wingtip with his transponders turned off, which means you can't detect him in a civil aircraft. And that's common now. That is common. And we often forget, while we think about those things, that in Japanese airspace, the Russian military aircraft still penetrate Japan's airspace, Kensuke, more so than China. Not much more so, but more so. The Swedes told me that they detected 3 Russian submarines in the archipelago that screens the territorial approaches to Stockholm. But the Swedes, like the rest of us, including this country, have dramatically run down their anti-submarine warfare capability. You know, one day we'll learn that there are other things we need to be good at, and the Swedes will now make that a very high priority. And the Finns told me that they